I call you all to attention. Thank you. We are starting. Thanks. Our next speaker was from Nottingham Trent, Emma Ferry. Unfortunately, she, due to ill health, is unable to be with us. But we have a marvelous substitute, also from Nottingham Trent. And so may I present Dr. Ilaned Edwards.
Okay, is that better? Yes. Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk about Indian block prints and global trade. So I'm going to do quite a long historical look, but very thin. So I'm skidding across the surface of lots of material and ending up in the 21st century. So it really is a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Okay. I wanted actually to start with a quotation from Mattibel Gittinger's book, Master Dyers to the World, which is now quite an old publication. It came out in 1983 and accompanied an exhibition of the same name, which was hosted by the Textile Museum, Washington. And in that book, she said, above the proficiency in making cotton textiles, India's crowning textile accomplishment was the patterning of this cloth with brilliant fast dyes. Textiles are amongst India's most successful exports, and the enduring popularity of block-printed cloth has sustained a centuries-old craft that survives and even thrives in the digital age. Block prints have been integral to the dress codes of the subcontinent, as well as serving domestic and ritual functions. Oops. They were also embedded in the material culture of diverse nations through centuries of international trade. So what's enabled their longevity and their global reach? This paper explores some of the factors that enabled Indian block prints to penetrate global markets across time, focusing on the mercantile activities of Indian entrepreneurs. It looks at 2 to 3 historical examples and then discusses more recent initiatives to sustain block printing and other crafts in India. And the latter have been played out against a socio-political backdrop in which craft, notably textiles, have been formative in attempts to forge a unified national identity in the post-colonial era. So this is where we start on the whistle-stop bit. I'm going to have a look at a quick look at trade and entrepreneurship, starting with the Indo-Egyptian cotton fragments, which Jababai alluded to in his presentation. So definitive evidence of Indian block printing is absent until the late 8th century. The earliest surviving examples of the craft are fragments of painted and block-printed cottons that were retrieved from various sites in Egypt and along the Red Sea. Produced in Western India, these cottons were part of the maritime trade between India and the Arab world that existed during the medieval period. Oh, sorry, that's one more ritual. There we go. The extensive Gujarati littoral had numerous natural harbours, a number of which developed into significant entrepôts. For example, Bharuch, formerly Barrier Gaza, Kambat, formerly Cambay, and Surat. Supported by a hinterland where textiles, minerals, and agricultural commodities were produced, these ports were at the heart of seagoing trade across the Indian Ocean and benefited from skilled local mariners who were able to exploit the monsoon winds, and also a fleet of vessels that were funded by enterprising merchants. The extent of that trade has been revealed by the discovery of textiles from Western India, not only in Egypt and at Red Sea sites, but also in Southeast Asia. So if I flick back to the original piece that I showed, hold on. Oops. So these fragments were retrieved from Egypt, and the later piece, this piece, was retrieved from Southeast Asia, but I think you can see the similarity in the patterning on the textile. So tends to support the thesis that block printers in Western India were producing for an extremely diverse and far-flung clientele. You know, at one end you're in Egypt and North Africa, and at the other end of the scale you're in Southeast Asia. So just to illustrate the point, that is the extent of that potential marketplace, or the market that was exploited. Excuse me. Again, moving on, I'm going to look at spices and chintz. So this is the trade with Southeast Asia. The Coromandel coast of southeast India was also an important hub. Trade developed via the networks of the eastern Indian Ocean, where Indian textiles became the principal goods traded for spices in the mechanisms that prevailed in Southeast Asia, embedding them in the material culture of the region as well as that of East Asia. So we're looking to China and Japan, Korea. The development of this extensive overseas market for Indian goods rested on the activities of India's merchant caste. Traders, notably Bohra Muslims from Gujarat and Kling businessmen from South India, were active in the intra-Asian spice trade, exchanging textiles for sought-after spices such as pepper, cloves and nutmeg, and other exotic goods such as rhinoceros horn, tortoiseshell and aromatics. The development of this extensive overseas market for Indian goods rested on the activities of India's... Sorry, I've just read that bit. Let me move on one, sorry. And just to give you a flavour of 16th century, when Europeans first were operating in Southeast Asia and India, Tomé Pires, who was commercial controller of the Portuguese fleet, said there is no place where you do not see Gujarati merchants. Gujarati ships come to these kingdoms every year, one ship straight to each place. And he actually writes quite extensively on the trading activities of the Gujaratis, and in some detail. The lure of spices eventually drew Europeans to the region in the 16th and 17th century. Once they'd mastered the mechanisms of regional trade, they exchanged gold bullion for textiles in India, where they were subsequently exchanged for spices in Southeast Asia. And it was the spice trade that spurred the formation of the East India companies, which were to evolve into empire builders, launching the prolonged colonial era. It also introduced Indian painted and printed cotton textiles to European markets in the early 17th century, initially as ballast in the spice ships of the East India companies, although these textiles later became fashionable commodities when the craze for chintz took hold. The popularity of chintz rested on its bright, colour-fast designs and the ease of maintenance of cotton, a new fabric for Europe where wool and linen were the usual fare, with silk reserved for the wealthy. Detailed instructions were sent from the company directors in London, including sketches and fabric swatches known as musters, to their factors or agents in India, to be reproduced by local artisans. Chintz evolved as a hybrid style of British, Indian and Chinese designs and enjoyed great commercial success, capturing the taste for chinoiserie that was in vogue in Britain and other parts of Europe in the 18th century. And I thought also to have a look at what was happening on the home market. So in India, block printers were adept at calibrating production to suit the requirements of a highly diverse clientele. Apart from catering for export, they enjoyed the patronage of Mughal emperors, regional rulers, and a host of others. they produce goods for the affluent merchant and land-owning classes, as well as the pastoral and farming communities of rural India. Just flick through a few here. Okay. Inevitably, European fashions moved on, and the demand for chintz had abated by the late 18th, early 19th century. So block printers, also dyers and weavers, faced difficult times as the fruits of Britain's industrial revolution were imported to India and began to undermine domestic textile production. But by the mid-19th century, India itself had started to mechanise production, and in cities such as Ahmedabad, which was to become known as the Manchester of the East, many block printers took jobs in the cotton mills and the printing factories, so that's roller printing factories that sprang up in the city, and probably one that you're familiar with, the calico mill. Looking at 19th and 20th century trade, I want to look at Sodagiri textiles. So these were textiles produced in Western India for very specific export markets. So it was the Siamese market. So it was a very specific trade between Gujarat and Siam. So Bora merchants, whose commercial activities I'd referred to earlier, they'd been embedded in Indian textiles in both the commerce, and they don't help to embed Indian textiles in both the commerce and culture of Southeast Asia in the early medieval period, were again to play a central role in the Sodagiri trade, which flourished between Gujarat and Siam in the mid-19th century. Four Bora dynasties, the Muscati, Vasi, Bagwal and Malbari families, developed these affordable cotton textiles aimed at the mass market in Siam, which we now know as Thailand. Like chintz, they were a hybrid. The designs fused Indian and Thai sensibilities, and the textiles were worn as unisex sarongs and women's shawls. Design intelligence was sent by Boras based in Bangkok to their agents in Gujarat, who commissioned printing blocks from engravers at Petapur, a village that adjoins the state capital of Gandhinagar, where there are surviving Sodagiri pattern books. I think they've actually moved from Petapur now. I think they're with Mala Sinha at Bodhi Textiles in Baroda. The textiles were printed in Ahmedabad by Muslim Chipa in Jamalpur and Astoria, and about 30 Hindu Bhavsa families in Petapur itself. At the height of the trade in the early 20th century, the Muscati family, to give you one example, employed 600 workers in their printing workshop in Astoria. The Boras' familiarity with the Siamese market and access to a skilled workforce in Gujarat was supported crucially by locally available resources, running water, cotton from local mills as well as Manchester, and an established export infrastructure through the port of Bombay. These factors, allied to changing sartorial codes in Siam that reflected King Chulalongkorn's modernisation programme, made for a lucrative business. The outbreak of the Second World War, however, disrupted commercial activity in the Indian Ocean, and the Sodagiri trade petered out. Despite this, Sodagiri-style sarongs produced in Thailand remain a staple garment, especially for older men. Oh, sorry, that's Manik Bhai Gadget at Petapur, sadly no longer with us, with his, sorry, I was a bit hasty there, with his design books, Sodagiri designs. And this is modern Sodagiri, which I picked up in Thailand a couple of years ago. I was told it is only worn by elderly men, but it's still a popular garment for that age category. Recent attempts to revive Sodagiri printing in Ahmedabad by Yasin Savaijiwala, whose family was involved in the trade, have met with little success as yet. But I was recently in Damadka, where Jabba and his family is now printing. They've recaptured some Sodagiri designs, so you've got a few designs coming through, haven't you? And I want to move on now to look at initiatives that have helped to sustain block printing in the 20th and 21st centuries. So it's thinking about this idea of craft identity in post-colonial India and how it's sort of anchored and the mechanisms for anchoring it. So I'm looking particularly at block prints and sustainable fashion. And again, it's a whistle-stop tour through that. So to explore that, I've chosen to do this again through the lens of entrepreneurship. I think it's a really interesting way to look at Indian craft, perhaps in the most viable way. And I'm going to have a quick look at Perot, the fashion label established by Anita Arora in 2008-2009. And in many respects, Anita and her company reflect government initiatives in the craft and education sectors launched following Indian independence in 1947. So I hope by focusing on her label, I'll be able to contextualise some of those policies that were introduced in the post-colonial era. So let me move on to Perot. There we go. Anita Arora's breakthrough collection hit the catwalk of New Delhi Fashion Week for autumn-winter 2011 and featured a rustic block print known as Ajrak, that's worn as cast dress by Muslim herders in the desert regions of Kutch and Thar in western India. The fabric had been printed in the workshop of a young artisan, Sufian Khatri, who is from the same family that we've been sharing time with today, Jabba's family. So they've been in Kutch district for the last 9 or 10 generations. And just to introduce you to Sufian, this is Adam's cousin brother and Jabba's nephew. Anit's collaboration with Sufian had started when she was a student studying textiles at India's flagship design school, the National Institute of Design, NID, at Ahmedabad in Gujarat. Established in 1961, NID was to be part of the modernising agenda of Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of independent India. The Institute's ethos was shaped by the famous India report of Charles and Ray Eames, which I think Archana referred to this morning, which recommended the establishment of an indigenous design legacy that exhibited a judicious application of both modern disciplines and old traditions to meet the challenges of contemporary India. Students were required to spend time in the field studying crafts, and craft documentation was an integral part of the diploma. Anit describes her experience in Kutch thus: "We were introduced to these craftspeople, and Kutch was the closest area. We met block printers from there, so all these techniques were introduced to us as students at NID. After NID, when I started my own label, I already knew how I would incorporate these things into my label. It did help to know them from the institution and then to approach them. NID was one of a slew of modern agencies, or nodal agencies, established by the Government of India from the 1950s onwards, that included the All India Handicrafts Board, the 1952, the Central Cottage Industries in the 1960s, the National Crafts Museum, that was 1956, and individual state-level craft development organisations from the 1960s onwards. The government's promotion of craft as a distinctive aspect of Indian culture and national identity reflects in part the legacy of Mahatma Gandhi, who used the symbolic power of khadi, hand-spun, hand-woven fabric, for the few in the room who might not be familiar with the fabric, in the campaign for independence, and envisioned independent India with a village-based economy in which craft production and agriculture were prominent. Craft was undoubtedly seen as a source of rural employment, but one that would generate revenue through export sales. The state organisations such as Gujarat State Handicrafts Development Corporation, established in 1973, were to play a key role in rural and economic development. Giri broke new ground when founding managing director Bridge Bassine, who we were fortunate to have with us today, and NID students, sent designers and NID students to work with rural artisans with the intention of adapting traditional craft products for urban markets. So going back to Sufian, his grandfather, Khatri Mahmud Sadiq, was one of the first to participate in the Gujari scheme, and his family never looked back. With a shrinking local market as cheap synthetic fabrics replaced handmade fabrics in Indian wardrobes, printing bedspreads, tablecloths and napkins for Gujari provided regular work for Mahmud Sadiq and his sons. Now 40 years on, Sufian Khatri, like many of his male affines, has found a distinctive market niche. His collaboration with Anita Arora rests on his interest in fashion and Perot's embrace of sustainable production. Sufian specialises in block printing with natural colours and, where possible, Anit sources organic fibres and incorporates heritage fabrics into her collections. An advocate of the slow clothes movement, she's conscious of fashion's impact on craft, and this is from an interview that I did with her a couple of years ago. I realised that it's not just about creating something for one time. You're giving employment to so many people, and fashion is a very different field. Every 6 months you've got to come up with something new. The first thing artisans ask is, how long will you give us work? Because they depend on it. Anit's approach and successive Perot collections have brought her encomiums of praise. Vogue applauded the label for its deep Indian roots, sustainable production, and a commitment to craft that translates into wearable femininity. Block printing is, to conclude, block printing is the result of the fortuitous conjunction of human ingenuity, natural resources, and serendipity. It's played a significant role in establishing India's reputation for craft, but alongside the subcontinent's legacy of artisanship, its heritage of entrepreneurship warrants equal regard. For, as Mr. Bassine himself said, no skill can survive unless it's exercised. The skill must have a customer, a patron. In India, a combination of mercantile ingenuity, craft skills, and adaptability has fostered a textile tradition that's made a lasting impression through centuries of global trade. And thank you very much. Now I'd like to introduce Ritu Sethi, who's going to, I'll just get this out of the way, who's going to give our next presentation.
I'll do it, ma'am. It's okay.
Thank you. He was on the phone outside. He's fine. He's fine. He's on the phone. Sorry, we were a bit worried about Mr. Bassine, who stepped out. Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for all staying on, even though the lunch was so hearty, and staying awake. The speakers before have brought together the positives in the huge effort we have experienced in India at sustaining traditional crafts and textiles. And Jabbar has put that forth most eloquently. So I really speak out of context in today's proceedings, as I'm going to inject a note of caution into the business of craft. Given that time is short, I spotlight just 4 of the issues that may pose threats to how the crafts are managed and sustained as they negotiate with globalization, urbanization, and an enhanced modernity in the years to come. The first is the paradox of the digital. With the internet footprint already covering up to 18,000 cities and over 2 lakh villages, We in India have taken to this global language like duck to water. This is increasingly reflected in the new possibilities and greater opportunities on offer for communication, for business, and the speeded up transmission of ideas. So it isn't surprising that this is shaping and shifting craft practice. Craftspeople are Googling, carrying on conversations, accessing new markets and materials, receiving designs, sending photographs, and fulfilling online orders. Though craftspersons managed websites still remain relatively few in number, larger numbers have Facebook pages. However, the number of commercial online sites selling craft products have proliferated, thus opening up new channels of sale and often entirely new customer bases, all increasing the digital footprint of their crafts. Online dissemination of information on crafts and its practitioners has also played a key role. One such effort is the online encyclopedia on traditional craftsmanship in South Asia, the initiative of the Craft Revival Trust, the organization I work with, that is information on over 1,500 living and endangered crafts and their practitioners from 8 countries. Further seismic shifts can be expected as plans of affordable connectivity to 90% of India by end of 2017 are being rolled out. With zero charges for voice calls and the lowest data rates in the world, we can only expect far greater change as many more Indians come online. And therein lies the paradox. While we are delighted with speeded up communication, we are also faced with the disruptive force of this digital tide. A threat perhaps equal to or greater than that encountered at the time of the Industrial Revolution of the late 18th century, when the great transition of hand production and mass production by new machine manufacturing processes took place. Digital technologies are the disruptive phenomena of our time, a double-edged sword. We cannot do without them anymore, and yet as we speak, new technologies are being developed to transfer and to reproduce, all with unimaginable accuracy and at lightning-fast speed. 3D printing already being old hat. These shifting digital sands can be expected to bring in increasingly fundamental social and economic changes in the way we produce and in the way we consume. The question that faces us today is what is the effect of this juxtaposition between the traditional handcrafts and ever-burgeoning digital developments? If I was to extrapolate into the future, based on evidence from the present, 2 broad scenarios seem to be emerging. The first, that excellence in craft will continue to rule, as time taken to slow-produced handcrafts with minute attention to detail will continue to have a great cachet, and that the demand for bespoke, customized heritage products will continue to excite attention in the future. On the other hand, the situation that we already face, that of copying, adapting, faking, will only escalate. Leading on from the digital is the age-old issue of replicated and fake craft products, now made more urgent. The stories are endless, from powerloom copies of handloom, resin casts duplicating as wood carvings, digital and screen prints of embroideries, of appliques, of shawls and of weaves, transfers of tribal and folk art, lost wax metal figures made in molds, and the many other instances that are replicated in thousands and marketed as handcrafted, handwoven, and traditional at far lower prices than the original. For many, this copying is a profitable business. This freely available cornucopia of heritage goods requires no investment in product development. Furthermore, the instant recognition and ageless appeal of these products and designs that are replete with cultural and symbolic values offers a ready market. This replication, with no fear of reprisal, thus makes for a win-win business model. For craftspeople and their communities who are at the receiving end of this free riding, it has led to not only huge economic loss of income and livelihood, a loss that can and does threaten hand production, it is equally a loss over the collective knowledge of their forefathers. This is further compounded by feelings of marginalization and helplessness due to their inability to prevent or effectively deal with this situation. Stakeholders, craft communities, and others no longer have the luxury of time to deal with these issues, as we are now faced with a digital present in which these cases of copying and passing off will only multiply. And I have here some pictures, and I'm not pointing any fingers. Some are from the most well-known designers that we all know, and some are from the most well-known craftspeople we all know, because this seems to be the symptom of our time. So, as we're all aware, like many other countries, we in India too have some legal recourse. As 13 years ago, in 2003, the Geographic Indication Act was put into place. Out of the 237 GIs that have been granted to date, a little over 60% of the total are in the area of heritage crafts and textiles, a noteworthy number, implying that the application for GIs is being taken seriously by the craftspeople. However, more than 13 years after the introduction of the Act, we are confronted with several challenges. The first being the paradoxical situation where the registration of GIs is on a pace, yet it begs the question as to why no handcrafted GIs have proceeded to use this powerful tool as a marketing opportunity. Iconic heritage crafts that have not taken the next logical step after registration to benefit from the provisions of the Act to brand and market under their own powerful logo, a right conferred to them alone. Additionally, why have none of the registered GIs used the law to proceed with infringement action against counterfeiters? Not even one single case to date. This underutilized potential of a powerful legal instrument, in fact the only legal instrument we have in this country to protect the handcrafts, is an indication of opportunities lost rather than of competitive advantages gained. We need to close this GI gap, acknowledging that heritage crafts are valuable business assets and prized brands. In the past, many of the traditional crafts were largely produced by extended families and within tight-knit patterns of professional kinships in which business and production was arranged. With craft production now increasing year on year, workshops and karkhanas are expanding and the old order is changing. Just one example is in Bagh, Madhya Pradesh, where Ibrahim Khatri, master block printer and national award winner, in his latest CV states that he employs 4,500 people to fulfill the orders he receives. With success comes greater scrutiny, and like Caesar's wife, heritage craft business needs to be above reproach. The business of craft requires that, like other businesses, it follows the laws of the land. For instance, the Factories Act of 1948 applies to any workshop or karkhana that has 10 or more artisans. A plethora of other laws and acts are also mandatory. From the Contract Labour Law of 1970, Apprentice Act, Child Labour Act, Employee Provident Fund Act, Minimum Wage Act, Air Emission and Control of Pollution Rule, Prevention of Chemical Exposure, Water Prevention, Environment, While we talk of zero carbon footprint and the ecological and environment-friendly nature of the crafts, we will sooner rather than later have to back up these claims with on-the-ground proof supported by facts and figures. This is not helped by newspaper reports, field research, and anecdotal evidence from the polluting of waters, dismal work conditions, use of toxic chemicals and dyes, and addition below minimum level pay. For instance, the exploitative daily wage of weavers in Bodoland in Assam and the outskirts of Banaras of rupees 35 to 50 per day. Sweatshop type conditions, poor lighting, lack of ventilation, lack of sanitation are only some such instances on a long list. As large retailers themselves come under scrutiny to source ethically, the onus will fall on them, on NGOs, on master craftspersons and weavers to ensure that norms are followed. From the use of responsibly sourced raw material, maintenance of pollution and environment standards to work conditions, better ergonomics and fire and safety issues, adherence to child labor laws, minimum wages and basic human rights. It's only a matter of time that crafts production will need to fulfill these basic expectations. In addition, with increasing interest overseas in heritage craft products, the need to comply with international codes of business will soon be the norm, or orders will dry up, as these are the necessary prerequisites that importers will demand. Regulatory compliances and standards are an essential part of an ethically driven business approach. This adherence will only serve to make the cultural heritage tag more meaningful. And my last point. At a seminar organized about a month ago by the Craft Revival Trust right here in IIC, a number of those who had been involved in some manner or the other with Judy Frater's educational initiative in Kutch came together to take stock of the decade of education for craftspersons and to map the road ahead. There were many takeaways, but here I talk only of 3 that are of relevance to the topic on hand. My first takeaway was amazing revitalization wrought by education on young craftsmen and women and their transformation into designers and business graduates. The impact of education was echoed by them themselves, by their faculty, their advisors, representatives of NGOs, designers, domestic and international marketers, and others who were present at the meeting. The second was a universal thought expressed by both the students and the craft patriarchs who were present. And that was that while economic success was being achieved by many, without relevant and appropriate education, there remained an inequality in their status as craft practitioners. As new inputs into their craft were assumed to be exclusively in the other's domain, while they, the craft people whose tradition was being explored, were relegated to a biddable, subservient role. Education gave them back their rights over their craft traditions. And my third takeaway was aspirations of these young men and women. Currently, the situation that faces us is broadly as follows. First, this sector that employs the second largest number of our fellow Indians. The numbers are uncertain, but anywhere between 20 to 45 to 100 million craftspersons and weavers continue in 21st century India to be educated in skills that are learned through oral instruction and apprenticeship outside the mainstream of the educational system. In addition, there is no policy in place that recognizes and acknowledges this oral learning, or what is now called received knowledge, within the formal educational system or the employment process. Second, as we all know, there is an increasing lack of interest in the younger generation in continuing in craft practice due to several reasons, not least being perceived prejudices and inequalities of status. In addition, the underlying belief that knowledge garnered from textbooks is superior to received oral knowledge has added on to the problem. This disassociation has been inimical to us all. The question that arises is, what can we do to fill this huge aspiration gap? What is critical, I feel, is to evolve methodologies that contribute to designing educational frameworks that are sensitive to the sheer complexity of the sector, without tokenism, making it a significant exercise. Taking a leaf from the Kala Raksha, Somaya Kala Vidya and Handloom School exercise. And perhaps studying models followed by other countries that realize the value of handicrafts once they faced a decimation in the numbers of craftspeople. For instance, Japan, Korea, and now more and more increasingly China, that is investing heavily in training the next generation of craftspeople. Simultaneously, there is an urgent need for a move towards greater equity, a removal of barriers within academia which are currently weighted against the bearers of traditional knowledge, moving again beyond tokenism to create substantive change through institutional development, formation of indigenous technology laboratories, the endowment of chairs in universities to bearers of traditional knowledge, and to the awarding of honorary doctorates. We have here Jabbar, whose older brother Ismail Khatri was in 2003 awarded an honorary doctorate by De Montfort University, Leicester. His learning given recognition outside his own country. In conclusion, I have some pictures. In conclusion, while we in India have experienced a huge effort at sustaining traditional crafts and textiles, yet given unstoppable change, craft futures continue to hold out a challenge. We as a nation cannot forge ahead unless we push the boundaries in a more equitable, even-handed, inclusive way. It will require a concerted and sustained effort to ensure that this essential part of our cultural fabric and these keepers of our traditional knowledge are nurtured and take their rightful place in the near term. The future depends on how we tackle these issues, whether we build to our advantage or let it all be frittered away. Thank you. So we will take a few questions before tea and last speaker and conclusions by Element.
Any questions from the floor for either of the two most recent speakers who passed the baton backwards and forwards?
also feel that we need to look at how certain government agencies which provide marketing opportunities, like Delhi Haat. If I were to go to Delhi Haat, there is responsibility there too. If I were to go to Delhi Haat today, I will definitely find screen printed on viscose all the designs of different textile traditions, including Madhubani, including Kalamkari, including Varli, of course, has really been out on the streets. Those dancing figures I've been dancing away all these years. So nothing in the hands of the original creators from whom, this entire repertoire has been taken. So I feel that in such instances where Delhi Haat, which is a government marketing space, where there are no checks and balances there, where there is no verification there itself, then a lay person going, I may know about one textile tradition, I may not know about the other. We have such a huge diversity, it's bewildering in fact. So and in a space where it's touted that authentic craftspeople come, and if these fakes are put there and they're passed off as originals, I'll very happily buy. So we have to look at this issue in a 360-degree angle, whether it is by oversight or just it is done deliberately, okay, you turn your face away and whatever it is. So there is responsibility from all sides. But for me, when I go as a consumer, to whom will I go? I go to Delhi Haat, I'm educated, I'm very aware, and I'm willing to fight that, I should be given the right products at the right place. But whom will I go and talk and fight? I'm speaking of okay.
Thank you. The Ajrak jacket that was displayed in the final fashion section of the exhibition. So I don't know how many of you managed to get to that. I appreciate it was in London, so perhaps not so many. But I think the furore really hit India. There was objection made to a jacket included in the exhibition that had been designed by Rajesh Pratap Singh. And it was a digital print of a design that is within the Ajrak portfolio, shall we say. And in London, they couldn't understand what the complaint was about. They just didn't get why this not nettled, but why it affected feelings so deeply over here. Because they couldn't see what the offence was. The object had been selected for inclusion in the exhibition because it was seen as a marriage between modern technologies and a heritage craft, which I suppose you could say it was. But I think what members of the V&A had failed to understand was the sensitivities around craft, which I think we've explored repeatedly today and in a very nuanced way. And it was something that Jabba's family was engaged in. They corresponded with the V&A, it's still not been satisfactorily explored. We couldn't get a really thorough dialogue going, but the point was got across in a letter from the Ajrak printers in Kutch, that if the V&A, which was this cultural organisation which commands the world, it promotes itself as the world's leading museum of design, if it was to take this position with, an object in its collection on public display in a major exhibition, and not, act responsibly with that, or at least, accept that there was cause for concern in displaying this object, then, how could the countries have faith in the museum as a purveyor of culture and a protector of heritage? And I think it's fair comment, but the problem also needed to be dismantled, because actually the design that was printed on the jacket wasn't Ajrak. It was part of the designs that were discovered in Egypt, in the so-called Fustat prints, and it had been reclaimed in a way by the Kutri block printer. So it was actually a very complex piece of deconstruction required, but it seemed that the V&A wasn't prepared to look at that, and didn't place enough value on the feelings of the agents of the authors of that body of craft. So I think while we all speak here as people concerned about craft and engaged in thinking about craft and protecting craft, and I used to work at the V&A, that an organisation like that can really ride roughshod over the feelings of craft producers and supporters of craft. So I think we can't rest easy on our laurels. We have to persist with our active support of craft and promoting it in all respects. And I appreciate that the audience here have expressed that time and again throughout the course of the day. But it's easy to stumble, and I'm very conscious that I still work with the V&A, that I'm involved with an organisation that has a somewhat questionable track record, really, in while benefiting enormously, because the Fabric of India was one of their top billing exhibitions. Indian textiles are always a surefire hit. That there was this issue that just wasn't dealt with there, and there was a lot of debate with the Kutris themselves. So it's been explored in print, and I know there was a very vehement online campaign that Asif Sheikh and I think Archana contributed to. People took this to heart, especially here in India. So we can't afford to luxuriate in the comfort of our knowledge of craft. It's got to be a thing that we maintain, that we're vigilant.
So on this, we break for tea for 20 minutes and then come back for Professor Jatin Bhatt's presentation. See you all in 20 minutes.
Okay. Yeah.
Paying the bill. Okay, sorry. 2 minutes. to our last session of the day. And we have with us Jatin Bhatt, Dean, School of Design, Ambedkar University, Delhi. Jatin, over to you.
Good evening, everybody. Well, I think first seeing Mr. Bhasin takes me back to my first brush with handicrafts. It was way back in 1975. Then I think we got a message from, I was a student at NID and got a message from Giri saying, are there any students who want to volunteer to visit Kutch and maybe find one, so-called nomadic artisan community? They, I think, were located by one of the UN Health Mission, and that's a message that came to Mr. Bhasin. I think I was one of the 3 students who volunteered, and I think we had a fantastic time, apart from the fact that after 6-7 days we were able to locate them. We really explored Kutch to the hilt, so to say. And I think that's... yeah, in fact, that report was very interesting. That, in fact, it led to Giri putting up a case for Indira Awas Yojana. And the first of the Indira Awas Yojana was based on the report that we prepared, and he actually made a much larger case out of that. So I think, yes. So what you see at Nirona in terms of the houses, are really the, initiative that Mr. Bhasin, who's already been recognized for phenomenal work in, on his contribution to crafts as such. Anyway, I think I would also like to recall a couple of earlier presentations to put what I'm going to talk about in the context of the day's proceeding. One, of course, is the whole story of the lace industry. And I think, Ritu, you mentioned that this may well be the case 50, 100 years down the line. There is what Ajna mentioned, and I think that is a very important aspect, is that while we are talking about crafts and the kind of patronage it has, it still is rather limited compared to the scale at which the craft industry exists. If we don't know the figures, even if it's 23 million or even 10 million, I don't think all artisans actually get their dues. And many of them who have an opportunity, exposure, orientation, and openness to work with, let's say, I don't know, whether it's Anokhi or Bandage or Fab India, are the ones who have actually done well. And many of them who also have worked with design, industries or designers, so to say, have done pretty well. But that is such a limited story. So that, I think, these two things are very important to, basically keep in mind. This, what I'm going to talk about are more questions that have emerged in the last about 6 months or so. And these also, interestingly, have been because of 2 of our students doing the final thesis project. One thesis project is about the effectiveness of any kind of a certification or a mark in the context of crafts, namely craft mark. And very interesting findings, I'll come to that later. And that actually raised a lot of issues that I'm going to briefly talk about. And the other project which is actually ongoing, that does not pertain to crafts, but it pertains to heritage per se. How do we involve community, in terms of connecting with the heritage that we have? And that largely talks about heritage, which is the built heritage. And Delhi, in fact, is one of the, places which has got phenomenal, numbers of built heritage in terms of monuments, etc., largely protected and literally protected by ASI, Archaeological Survey of India, and therefore very little in terms of flexibility happens there in terms of actual community engagement. All the same, that's another inquiry that is ongoing, but that essentially raises a larger question. We talk about something just come there. He's doing something there. We talk about craft as cultural heritage. I think we forget, I think Prabhin did mention that we need to do a lot about the patrons, namely customers. I think what has happened up till now in terms of initiatives. If you talk about crafts, ones which are in black are the ones where I think we are rather strongly focused on. Ones which are in whites or grays are something which I believe need to be looked at more critically. If you look at culture in the context of crafts, I do not know what culture we're talking about, because I think very little of the culture within which the crafts evolved and their practice actually remains. So in a sense, we're talking about culture which has its own history and therefore its significance in terms of certain heritage value. Heritage itself is questionable, because I don't know how many people appreciate crafts as heritage in that sense. And we are talking about a very small group of people who are sitting in the room, and there are others. But that's a minuscule kind of a group which recognizes craft and other heritage as anything of significance. Sustenance is something which is hugely addressed, because it's largely seen as an economic activity. It's something which gets connected with livelihoods, and therefore it somehow fits into a perpetual story of the fact that we need to have people employed meaningfully. Local environments, again, I'm not too sure what it means when we talk about local environments. Are we talking about the local environments in terms of the marketplace? Are we talking about local environments in terms of the practitioners and the ecology of crafts within which they are practiced? Now, these are issues that need to be looked at. Up till now, I believe we have focused largely on the artisans and the crafts in terms of its practice, more like an inward-looking kind of initiative, where, of course, very rightfully so, the issues have been about the concerns of the artisans, and therefore that's what we are trying to address. So design is something which has been rather aptly handled in many cases, and some cases at least with good intentions. Livelihoods continues to be on one of the top of the agendas when we talk about crafts, and all the time one thing that we keep in mind is livelihoods. Most of our efforts are about market access, so what we do is promote crafts, and by and large promotion is limited to people who we assume appreciate in some or the other form crafts as such. Artisan training is something which has been substantive focus in that sense. Skill development, techniques and technology are the dimension that I think there has been good amount of support and initiatives. And of course, knowledge protection, we talked about GI as such, which is one of the areas in which I think fair amount of work has been done. Whether successful or not, it's a different story. As I said, these are largely about the practitioners. But is that enough for the sustenance of what we call the craft of cultural heritage in that sense? I think we are missing something, and that happens to be the customer. We are rather reactive to the customers. I don't think we have done much in terms of customers. And when you talk about customers, we are talking about today, we are talking about maybe 5 years, 3 years, and the immediate or direct kind of connect or relationship that we enjoy with the customer. We are not actually looking at developing true patrons. True patrons need to be looked at a different level. Are we looking at a larger issue, which I think pertains to countries like India? Do people value skills per se? Forget about crafts. Why is it that we have a larger, kind of a hiatus between something which is done with hands or something which is done with minds, as they call it? And that is a deep-rooted kind of an issue that we need to address. Within that, if we need to look at crafts, I think it needs to be looked at right at the level of education. To my mind, school children are the ones where we need to locate crafts in. I've seen that some of the schools, especially in urban areas, have started to have workshops with actual practicing artisans, even if it's for 4 hours. and children dabbling with, trying their hands at some of these craft skills. I do not know if that, in a way, helps to really create something that we believe would be a true value, or someone who would really patronize. So the larger question is, what is it that we need to do to ensure that we create informed patronage? When I talk to an average person who I accompany to, buy crafts, you generally entertain them to make sure that when they visit you, you take them to Kamala shop, which you think is one of the places where they must visit. You take them to Fab India. Bandage is not in Delhi. Was, yeah. So these are some of the places where you take them to. Now, if you try and understand the mind of a typical customer, and that customer goes not because the person is interested in crafts, the customer goes because I am the host. And I'm going to say this is where you're going to visit, this is where you can buy something that you cannot buy anywhere else in the world. And that's how I expose them to what I call crafts, so what I tell them about what Indian crafts is. Now, it's very interesting that then, of course, there are issues like our motives that they see on an object or fabric, crafts. Is that what they connect when they talk about crafts? Are objects which are made in a particular way are seen to be crafts? The context, which I don't know whether it exists anymore, but is that, or the story, that is how historically it was placed, and it has a lineage, it has certain significance in terms of its traditional value. Is that something that people seek in crafts? Is it about the materials that we talk about? Is it about the techniques that we talk about when we say this is crafts, or this is something which you have to look at in terms of heritage? Are we looking at place of origin? Where does it come from? Is that something which gives craft its unique value? Or is the tradition and history that we talk about that gives craft a unique value? Now, these are things which are multiple perceptions that customers who are not informed, poorly informed, insufficiently informed have about craft. So that's why when we talk about, we have this debate of what is authentic craft. Now, authentic craft is subjective. All these are interpretations of what people think craft is, and there are many more. I've just listed some. Now, that seems to be one of the major challenges that we have. How do we actually engage with our supposed patrons? So where do we start? I believe one of the areas that has not been significantly addressed is really the tourism. Because most places where crafts have survived in India, and Agra is an example of how crafts have survived. And I can tell you that very little of what we call new design sells in Agra. What people buy is what they see on Taj. And that's a very organic development of crafts vis-a-vis tourism, right? Similarly, I think post-earthquake, Kutch is another example where tourism has directly connected with recognition, appreciation, value, and patronizing of crafts. I think that's something that have happened. But as far as Kutch is concerned, I think it's both the fact that earthquake actually brought in world attention to that particular region, and apart from that, there have been very concerted efforts to make sure that the opportunity which came in the way of natural calamity was leveraged to give it a more holistic value. We talked a lot about protection. Now, it's a very debatable issue. I think we can talk about GI for 3 days. But main issue in protection is about what is it that a person wants to see. However much I talk about what craft stands for, I think these are value lenses. We have positions in terms of values that we want craft to be, and all of us have a position. Finally, the patron or the customer also has a position. So whether I promote GI or not, how much of significance or meaning does, a person attach to it? Exclusivity, to my mind, has worked extremely well in crafts, and is something that needs to be, perpetuated. I think that's what would, in a way, or has to some extent, led to a lot of brands which are basically rooted in crafts. And market presence, that's the other thing which, to my mind, has sustained the crafts the way it is, whether it is in terms of hearts or exhibitions or boutique stores or, multi-city stores like Fab India. But there are two things that have worked very well in crafts in terms of sustaining culture. We have been able to build a significant, appreciation and value for crafts in that sense. Again, it's very limited. It's not something which, has really exploited the full potential of what craft can do. Museum collections, again, I think Indian museums, as far as craft is concerned, are disappointing, to say the least. There's very little that I see, in terms of, proactive outreach of museums vis-a-vis crafts, so to say. Of course, the museums have other roles as well, but I think if we talk about crafts as one of the, values in terms of heritage that we are talking about, it's a living heritage. It's not something which has disappeared like many other countries. So what is it that museums can do? I don't see, any workshops or, lectures or, events that go out of the museum. You have to go to the museum to attend events. I have not seen museums going out to say, okay, we are going to hold workshops across these 100 schools. And these schools don't have to be the private schools. Is it possible to have workshops on crafts and heritage with government schools? Are we not talking about people who are also going to be potentially the ones who will recognize their own heritage, they may be potential patrons? Education, I think Praveen did mention about the fact that Harvard did a phenomenal, I in fact gone through that case study. I've used it as well in my earlier teaching, so to say, on Fab India. There have also been subsequently more case studies on some of the other, craft stories. Now, I have not seen crafts being taught at all in, let's say, architectural education. These are guys who deal with, built environment. They all the time challenge with creating something which gives the final user a unique identity, something that differentiates one workplace, home, what you call hospitality, different from the other. And there's very little by way of exposure, except for CEPT. CEPT actually has a full-fledged program in craft, so to say. But there are about, last count, some 700 odd architectural programs in the country, 700 schools of architecture. Not a single one, except barring about 3 or 4, has any exposure to craft, so to say. And these are guys who actually have a voice. They have the influence. Architects continue to have influence on developing what we call informed patronage. They are the conduits through which we propagate some of the values that we are attaching to crafts. Marks and certification. Very interesting finding that we had, that this craft mark as such is hardly recognized or valued by more than about 7% of the customers. Rest of them couldn't care less if the mark was there or not. Now, that actually begs the question as to why, despite some of the most earnest efforts by ICA, which is promoting craft mark, it's not working. We need to look at maybe some other marks which have worked and try and understand that they do have a potential in terms of influencing customers, in terms of creating, certain understanding, appreciation, and value for crafts. But why is it that it's not happening? Hallmark is something which I was a part of. I worked very closely with World Gold Council and, of course, Government of India. It was about 4 years, 4.5 years of argument and building up of the acceptance of hallmark with the jewelers. It wasn't the government which was difficult. It was the jewelers who were difficult. Well, you know how jewelers operate, so it's very obvious that nobody wanted a mark which certifies the actual quality and purity of gold and silver. It did succeed. In fact, now there are more people wanting to buy jewelry with the print which says this is hallmark jewelry. It actually tells you the purity of gold and silver. Now, this is something which is very significant. How it happened? Extremely aggressive marketing about what does hallmark stand for. It is in your interest. What you're buying is something which would add to the value that you're spending. Now, this is something which is significant. Wool mark is another story. Wool mark couldn't have succeeded. It's all about purity of wool that you're buying. They're not saying you buy 100% wool. Well, ideally, yes. But what they're saying is wool mark is something which certifies the quality and the percentage of wool in something, but its authenticity, that you're not buying anything else but wool. Now, this is something which has not happened in a measure that it should have happened. So, in a way, the whole idea of I've also been a part of certifying the crafts for craftsmark, so-called the jury, which takes place at ICA. And that's where some of these questions, in fact, need to be revisited. What is it that you want to take to the final patron? What is it that you want to communicate to people when we say this is craft mark? Same, but a very interesting story which has just emerged, and this is something which I was checking about 15 days ago, in the context of this presentation itself. Pashmina, I think Chandrasekhar mentioned that it took us about 4.5 years. I was instrumental in initiating the fact that GI is something which is going to be of value to the crafts of Kashmir, predominantly Pashmina and similar kind of crafts. And that's where I made the first presentation. But my warning was, no certification is good unless it is hugely backed by aggressive marketing. People need to know what your certification stands for. And there has to be a process which is objective, which is something which cannot be copied, and there has to be a way in which people recognize something. There is a state-of-art lab which has been set up in Srinagar along with the Craft Development Institute. This initiative, by the way, was largely Craft Development Institute, and the lab has, in last about 4.5 months since it's operational, certified 1,500 Pashmina shawls. And every month they're getting 150 shawls at least as an average for certification. The elaborate process actually certifies the shawl under certain set parameters. These parameters are communicated. Each shawl is marked with what is called nanotechnology mark. This is the most advanced way of marking. It cannot be copied, so to say. And you can take that shawl back after 10 years. It can be scanned. It will tell you who made it, when it was made, what was the actual composition. Every little detail is there, embedded in that nanotechnology chip. It's a mark. Now, this is amazing. Well, the bad part of the story is against 1,500 shawls which have been, certified, there are about maybe 30,000 shawls which are sold as Pashminas, which are not Pashminas. Well, they sell Pashminas for 300 rupees. So. Now, these are also true stories. So, what are we fighting? So, there is this whole issue about something which is working, but how do we make it effective? And why do they sell 30,000 Pashminas which are not Pashminas? Who sells them? They are not some outsiders. They are the same very Pashmina manufacturers who have their alternative businesses sitting in Amritsar. Now, but that's where it is. I mean, there are guys who want to buy Pashmina which looks like Pashmina, but doesn't have to be Pashmina, and there are people who care for Pashmina. Now, these are differing gray scales or the layers of so-called current and emerging patron we need to keep in mind. Well, you couldn't have sold only single malt whiskey. You had to have blended whiskey, yeah? So, Scotch. Well, it's finally about economics, I think. Basically, if you're talking about heritage and craft sustenance, yes, 2 minutes, I'll be done. Yeah. What is it that you want to sustain? To me, I think through the day, some of the issues which came up are equally important, apart from the fact that it's economics. It's about pride. It's about dignity. It's about traditional knowledge that artisans have. It's about aspirations of the artisans. How do you continue to have our new younger generations of artisans engaged with the future practice of artisans? The practice itself, and bottom line is, it has to give dignified livelihoods to people. So, if you want this to be valued, craft to be valued, it has to be skill, people, identity, history, traditions, materials, techniques, motives, authenticity, which I think is something I'm slightly worried about that word, because craft is something which has changed. Cultures have changed. I saw original paper mache, which was huge, motifs on the ceilings in Kashmir. Well, you don't even see those kind of motifs or colors or even the application where it's done. So things go through transformation. So what is authentic is something that we need to question. But concern and care is something that we certainly want to, have as a part of the value amongst our patrons. And of course, we want them to value the practitioners, give them, respect and dignity. And of course, I think most wonderful thing in the world is the fact that we have diversity of expressions. Won't bore you with this too much, but these are some of the things that one could look at. Well, craft heritage in education, it should be there in, primary schools, secondary schools. So why can't it be in part of our curriculum, so to say? And roles of museum as more proactive interface, marks and certifications as more kind of so-called effective differentiators. Craft-based tourism, to my mind, is a huge opportunity. Enabling continuity of next generation practices, as Jabbar Bhai has succeeded in doing. And media exposure and promotion. We're not using media enough. I think we need to do more of media to get people to value craft as heritage. And of course, heritage will be valued if it has some connection with consumption. I'm under no illusion that a heritage will be valued for its sake. And then finally, the value of heritage is determined by the perception through which the people will connect it. And it's based on how their perception is shaped. So, we are the ones who need to do this. We are the ones who have to engage proactively with potential patrons as the core constituents of the sustenance. So to me, bottom line is you need patrons, good, informed, intelligent, appreciative patrons. And we have questions as to how to get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jatin. Are there any questions? Chandrasekhar looks like he wants to ask a question. Yeah.
I think since morning what we've been hearing is almost everything is okay. People are copying you okay, you're lifting ideas okay, you're practicing okay. So what I feel, more than questioning everybody else, we need to question ourselves. What you want to do, then trying to say what Kulkarni we should do. I should not worry about what Kulkarni does. I need to worry what I can do to contribute in this entire thing. And I just need to worry about my bit. That doesn't mean isolation. It's very important to be aware of what is happening and at the same time see what I can do. And that's probably the shortest answer to all these this exploration which are going on. What do you have to say, Jatin?
Chandrasekhar has told us we shouldn't have had this seminar. We should have just sat at home and contemplated and discussed it.
I just feel that the question of certification and these things things come only when things start selling in the market of what was practiced, say, 100 years back or 1,000 years back. Nobody thought about certifying that at that point. It was something which was practiced, something which was sold, and people kept on using it for their day-to-day life. Now the market has, the whole thing has changed because now they have to find different market. And they have now started selling out of their domain into some other domain. And that's when these issues are coming. So that whole thing has become important to have those identified processes of their craft or textiles, which comes as a question when even the court asks if somebody is copying and somebody says this is my original, they go into asking for the process which is followed. Yeah. So if you have the processes which are put in place and if you mark it onto your tag, this is how we are following it, this is how we are doing it, there has to be promotion from the craftsman side to say that this is how I have done it. And the other person will not be able to show the same process, and that's where they can have some kind of an edge over the person who is copying it. Because this is something which has happened with us when we had designed something, created a collection, and before we could put it into the market, it was in the market. By copying somebody who has understood what we are doing, they had put it into the market. But when we put up a case, the court asked these questions. And then we were able to win this case, and that collection was dumped by other person. So this is how it will work if we have some process which is worked out.
I have to add one thing here, that what worries me is not buying a sari or a sarong or a dupatta that is printed by silkscreen. There's a lot of effort that goes into silkscreen printing also. It doesn't even worry me when I buy a digital print. What worries me is when I'm told it is block printed and I pay the price of block printing. And that is actually cheating. Because that is the problem. And like was said earlier, and was said by Jabbar Bhai also, that is the same craftspeople, and we all know how common it is to screen the whole sari and block print the pallu. No problem.
Yeah, or do the first layer.
Yeah, exactly, and then the other. No problem. Just tell us what you're doing. You have a market for every level. You have a market for a museum level piece, which is hugely expensive and has taken 6 months to produce. And you have a market because this is democracy. And we can't stop you from doing anything. But tell us what you're doing so we pay the price, that we buy what we are paying for. So that is one aspect, I think, which we must bring out also.
Slightly not so well articulated observation, but in my understanding, craft is a small, has smaller production capacities than industrial. Firstly, that's why industrial came in. So craft doesn't have that critical mass to probably, change things or move things accordingly. Like we're all sitting here and wanting crafts to be successful, but it has only that much body and not enough critical mass to turn things around. Like, when we're talking of GI, the wines were able to successfully market it because they had money power. Stakes in craft, even the entire craft industry is way smaller. So it's not enough. It's so depressing. So, we've always heard this, that craft is the second largest employer, but everybody here also today said that we're not sure of the numbers. It could be 10 million or 40 million, but agriculture we know is 1 point something billion. So in a study that I was doing, I tried to see that what is the number of craftspeople, and what I came about this, what I understood was, and I may be all wrong about this, that only around, less than 10% of the population is artisan groups. So that's really small. Yeah, but we're not being able to utilize it. It's huge, yeah, it's big a number, but it's not converting into economic. I'm saying this with caution.
I understand what you're saying, Tanveen, but what I want to say is Fab India, for just one example, Fab India would never have to been able to grow from one store to 200 stores if there's mass of people. Meeta herself prints, I think, 20,000 meters a year, if not more, and she refuses orders because not that she can't do it, she doesn't want to do more. In one season, look at how much they're printing. The thing is, if you can pay well, you can get the people. We have too much unemployment in this country. You have to be able to train the people. People are willing to be trained. They want to learn. Yeah, exactly. Quite right. Yeah. That gives respect. Yeah. Sorry.
Correctly, what you're trying to say is the finances of it, that there isn't that much money to be able to push the craft mark to be able. Is that what you're trying to say? Not the numbers of people.
Yeah. I was saying both. I was saying both. I was saying, one, there is not enough money, like when Rituji was saying that, when she also raised the point, I think ultimately it was that there wasn't enough money. If Jawahar Bhai is like a jhanja, it's because who's going to go to the courts and waste your time every day to figure that out. That's one thing. And the other thing which I did say, I say with caution, but I do say it, is that it appears that there are not enough numbers. In a way, industrial revolution was an evolution of crafts only. That is also what I'm saying.
That's a whole mini conversation.
Yeah, Meera?
Yeah, so this is a question I kind of often grapple with, and you rightly pointed out that the crafts, when you refer to culture, when you try to see crafts at the prism of culture, actually the culture which produced that has changed. It no longer exists the way it was, which produced that. So then, what is really authentic? Because what was authentic was what was produced within a certain set of circumstances. And if today, say, 3,000 people are making fake pashmina, because the reality is that they need to get livelihood at any cost. And so, they are willing to engage in all kinds of practices because the livelihood is a reality. So is that authentic then? Because the situation is forcing them to act in a certain way. And secondly, I also feel that we're constantly talking of the customers and patrons as those who can afford to pay for either exclusive products or with certain kind of contemporary, modern, appreciation. But I also feel that we need to figure out ways of how people can start using craft again in the local cultures, even if it means government is subsidizing some of those purchases, because that's what is going to keep it, in terms of the practice, is going to keep it active, vibrant. The vibrancy that comes with interaction with designers and urban markets is a different sort of vibrancy, geared into a different direction. But if you have to keep it local, contextual, and ensure that it continues a lifeline from the culture from which it has come, then you have to find ways to promote local consumption of it.
Yeah. One, of course, about culture. You're right that when you're talking about cultural heritage, you're actually talking about something that not necessarily be alive and active in the sense it was. And of course, so in a way we're talking about a lineage from where some of these things have evolved, and appreciation of history and the legacy that we all have and we all own, in the sense of a certain identity, a certain sense of pride, certain sense of connect in that sense. So that's what you're trying to talk about when you're proud of your heritage. Of course, heritage is something which, in a way, is left behind in that sense. So that's something which you're trying to promote here. As far as authenticity is concerned, I also have questions about what is authentic. And Ritu rightly said that, well, if it's screen printed, it has its own certain value, so to say. So I'm not too sure what is authentic in that sense. And maybe I think 1 year ago I would have been saying, no, I would have fought for authenticity. I'm questioning that whole story about what is authentic in that sense. In the context of what it is. As far as the local consumption is concerned, well, Khadi has been subsidizing, Khadi products for ages, But how much of that actually gets used by local is something which needs to be, seen. So there is a benefit. So if there is a benefit, of course, it has its own value. Would crafts actually fall into, in fact, a lot of crafts apparently also fall into KVIC brief, so to say, So there is some amount of overlap there. But I do not know if that is the answer. There's also the answer would be that can you make something which is affordable? Do crafts have to be exquisite? Can they be affordable? That's the other question. Can they still be affordable and not, very exquisite, so to say? More informed means that you have various lenses through which you're saying this is crafts, and let the patron decide what lens, but at least patrons are informed. Of course, you can't force a patron to say they only buy this, but at least that when 10 lenses through which you say this is something which brings value to crafts and craft practice, so to say.
I wanted to talk about increasing local consumption. In Manipur, what they've done, some of the backstrap loom textile, they're using them as a school uniform. Now, that is a wonderful idea, because you are actually teaching children to respect their culture, and you ensure the annual consumption of craft product. Similarly, if you look at Banasthali Vidyapit, which is about 10,000 people, women studying together, all of them wear khadi. And that is the largest concentration of khadi users, I think, in the entire world. Now, somewhere you need to, sometimes these policy decisions make a lot of difference. So, This is a little funny, but I want to share this. I don't remember where I heard it. The creativity is a unique recombination of older ideas. So that's what is one which I thought was very interesting. And second thing was originality is an art of hiding the source. And that's how it is.
We're talking about the customer, so I'm tempted to quote Tom Ford of the Ford cars when he said that if I had asked my customers, they would have wanted a faster horse. So I think that's true about crafts also. Sometimes we need to be like, that's the example with Apple also. I mean, Steve Jobs was looking ahead 20, 30 years, and that's why he came up with what he came up. And I think maybe as craftspeople and designers involved in crafts, we need to have that responsibility too.
I will remember. Yeah, I'm just not Pavlov's dog. I'm just. So, thank you very much for all of you coming today and sticking with us so conscientiously through the long hours of the day in a rather overheated room. But I think we've witnessed a very earnest discussion here. And just to let you know what will come of the presentations that have been given at this symposium in Delhi and at the symposium that we hosted at Nottingham Trent in March. With light touch editing, they're to go onto the Craft Revival Trust website. So I think they'll be part of the Asia Inch, the online encyclopedia of craft. So all the papers, it's our intention to put all the papers on the Craft Revival Trust website to keep the discussion going and just to release, the research that's been carried out so that you'll be able to access them, not immediately because we do need a bit of time to knock the documents together, but they will be there over the next few months. And finally, I'd just like to say thank you so much to Ritu Sethi, who pulled out all the stops for this event. Couldn't have managed it. And Mehek, where's she at the back, who has just done sterling work. So thank you very much. But we mustn't ignore your role too. So thank you very much, Ritu, for your fantastic support and leadership on this. And finally, thank you all very much. Nice to meet you. Yeah.
Especially on a Saturday and a lovely
Yeah.
day outside.
We drag you in here. So I just need. Yeah, I need
to my head.
Okay, I was going to say I need a receipt. I just want to give him as well.